Welcome to our deep dive into adolescent psychological development. We're going to be taking a look at some really interesting research by David Moshman, all thanks to your requests. He's an expert in the field, and his book, Adolescent Psychological Development, Rationality, Morality, and Identity, has a ton of thought-provoking stuff in it.
It's a dense read for sure. You're ready to move beyond the usual, it's just hormones, talk about teens.
Absolutely. And actually, Moshman kind of throws a curveball right away by questioning what we even mean by development. I gotta admit, this tripped me up at first.
Yeah, he really emphasizes that not every single change a person goes through equals development. You might change your favorite band, you might change your hairstyle. Those aren't really developmental shifts.
So what does Moshman consider to be a developmental change then?
He lays out 4 big things to look for. He says a change is developmental when it lasts a while, meaning it's extended. It's got to be self-regulated, meaning the person is a part of the change and not just having it happen to them. It needs to be qualitative, not just like more of the same. And it's moving towards something. There's a progression.
So if we take puberty as an example,
Hmm.
it hits all those points, right? It's biological development we're all familiar with.
Yeah, definitely. But what I'm getting at is that the changes in how teenagers think are just as huge, just a lot less obvious.
Okay, so less about growing taller and more about like mental leaps they're making.
Exactly. And one of the biggest of those leaps is what's called formal operations. It's a term from Jean Piaget, a pretty famous psychologist. You actually pulled a really great example from the book about this, the pet store puzzle. Do you want to take us through it?
Oh, right, sure. So imagine you're at a pet store with a kid. You see, let's say, 6 dogs and 4 cats. You ask the kid, are there more dogs or more animals? Now, a younger child might say, more dogs. Because to them, what they see right there is all there is.
Right. They're stuck in what Piaget called concrete operations. Their thinking is all about the stuff they can physically see and touch.
Gotcha. But a teenager, on the other hand, they've developed these formal operations. So they get that dogs are part of this bigger category, animals.
Exactly.
Even if there were like 100 cats, there would still be at least as many animals as dogs. That's pretty abstract.
It is. They're not limited to what's right in front of them anymore. And that ability to think abstractly, it's kind of a game changer for how they understand the world. Suddenly, things like algebra make sense, or they can really get into debates about philosophy, even grasp complex social issues in a different way.
Makes sense, but does that mean, like, boom, teenagers are suddenly perfectly logical beings now?
Well, not quite. Formal operations are a big step, but even adults mess up logic puzzles all the time. Remember the selection task from the book? That one trips up pretty much everyone.
Oh, yeah. The one with the cards, where you have to figure out the rule by flipping them over. I definitely didn't get that one right away.
Exactly. And that kind of shows us that being rational is more complicated than just acing formal logic. Moshman actually suggests 2 other pieces of this puzzle, scientific reasoning and metacognition.
Okay, those sound kind of intimidating. Can you break those down for us a little?
Yeah, so scientific reasoning is basically like having a little scientist in your brain. You can test out ideas, see what the evidence says, and come to conclusions based on that. It's about being systematic in how you think.
Okay, that makes sense.
And metacognition is even trippier. It's basically thinking about your own thinking, like being aware of your own thought processes, any biases you might have, and being able to change your approach if something's not working.
So, like, a teenager might be awesome at physics, totally nailing formal operations there, but they also, like, forget their lunch 3 days in a row because they haven't quite mastered that planning and self-regulation part. It's like my teenage self, honestly.
That's a perfect example. It explains why teens can be super smart about some things, but make totally baffling decisions about others. Their rational toolkit is still under construction.
Speaking of construction, another big thing teenagers develop is their sense of morality. And Moshman uses a pretty intense example to dive into this: female circumcision.
Right. And it's important to approach this topic carefully. We're dealing with different cultures and personal rights here. What Moshman does is use this example to contrast 2 ideas. One is moral relativism, which says right and wrong depend totally on your culture. The other is this idea that everyone develops their own moral reasoning, even if it is shaped by the culture they grow up in.
So, like, on one hand, it's whatever your society says goes. And on the other, even teens are figuring out right and wrong for themselves, even if it starts with what they're taught.
Exactly. Makes you think, right? How much of what we consider right and wrong is just what we were told as kids? And how much came from our own thinking and questioning, especially as we got older, like those teenage years?
And it gets even more interesting here because you mentioned Moshman goes beyond the classic Kohlberg model of moral development, the one that's all about justice and rules. He brings in the care and virtue perspectives.
Absolutely. Kohlberg's important, don't get me wrong. But it can feel a bit limited when you think about the actual moral dilemmas teenagers face.
Hmm.
The care perspective highlights relationships, empathy, thinking about how your actions affect other people.
So it's not just follow the rules, but think about how this impacts people I care about.
Right. And then the virtue perspective focuses on those good character traits,
Hmm.
honesty, courage, compassion. It's not just about avoiding bad stuff, but trying to be a good person overall.
Which maybe explains why, for teens, doing the right thing isn't always enough. They're also wrestling with, am I being a good friend? Am I supportive? Am I living with integrity? Like deeper questions of who they want to be, not just what actions to take.
You got it. And that leads us perfectly to the next big construction project teens are working on,
Hmm.
their identity.
Oh, yeah, the big one, the who am I question. But Moshman doesn't approach this in the usual way either, right?
He really doesn't. He says identity isn't something you just find, like a lost treasure. You build it. It's an active process, kind of like a scientist coming up with a theory. He calls teens scientists of the self, constantly testing and refining their idea of who they are.
So less who am I and more what's my current theory about myself and how am I checking if it holds up?
Love that. And Mushman says there are 4 key parts to this theory of self: agency, rationality, singularity, and continuity.
Okay, break those down for me one by one. Agency, I'm remembering, is about feeling like you have control over your own life, that you make your own choices.
Exactly. And rationality in this context means understanding yourself, your actions, why you do what you do, creating a story that makes sense, even if that story changes over time.
Okay, makes sense. What about singularity? I'm guessing that's the feeling of being one whole person, even when you're feeling all these changes and contradictions inside.
You got it. And continuity, the last one, is about connecting your past, your present, and your future into a single self that makes sense. How did the stuff you've experienced make you who you are today? Who do you want to become in the future? It's all connected.
Oh, that's a lot for anyone to process, let alone teenagers who are already dealing with so much change.
Totally agree. And don't forget, all this is happening within a specific culture, which adds even more layers to this whole identity construction project.
Right, because there's this idea out there that only Western cultures care about individual identity. Other cultures are all about fitting in, right? But Moshman kind of pushes back against that.
He does. He argues that forming an identity is a human thing. It happens everywhere, even if it looks different depending on your culture. Some cultures might focus on interdependence. Being part of a community is key to who you are, but it's still figuring out your place in the world.
So even in cultures where fitting in is super important, teenagers are still working out who they are and how they fit within that.
Exactly. And that's important to keep in mind when you're interacting with teenagers from different backgrounds. What looks like rebellion might actually be them trying to figure out how to be themselves within their own culture.
That's such a good reminder that even though there are these universal processes happening, how they unfold can be totally different for different people.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, right? We're talking about what makes us human on a fundamental level, but also the huge variety of ways that can play out.
Absolutely. My brain is already buzzing with all these new ideas.
Mine too. We've covered a lot of ground already, from that shift to formal operations to how culture and individual development shape morality and identity. Ready to dive even deeper into how all of this plays out in real life.
Absolutely. Lead the way. Okay, so we've laid some serious groundwork here with Moshman's ideas about what makes adolescence such a unique period of development. But how does all this abstract stuff actually play out in the real lives of teenagers?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Moshman's great at bringing these ideas to life with real examples and stories.
Yeah, one that stuck with me was the one about the selection task, that brain teaser we were talking about earlier. Moshman talks about a study where they gave this task to kids and adults and watched how they figured it out.
And it wasn't just about getting the right answer right. Even when people got it right, the way they thought about it was all over the place. It really shows you how messy and unpredictable cognitive development can be.
Totally. He even describes this group of teenage friends trying to solve it together. And it's like, boom, you see all this stuff we've been talking about in action, logic, metacognition, even a little peer pressure thrown in there.
It's a good reminder that even when teenagers have the ability to think logically, Consistently using that logic in real life, that's a whole different challenge. It's a skill you build up over time with practice and experience.
It's like when you're learning to drive, you know? You might know all the rules, but actually being out there in traffic, making decisions on the fly, that takes practice. And probably a few close calls along the way, let's be honest.
You're so right. Another cool example Moshman uses is the one about spatial perspectives. He talks about these two kids, Nora and Simon, standing on opposite sides of a room.
Oh yeah, I remember this one. Nor says a bench is in front of a table, but Simon says it's behind the table. And they're both positive the other one is wrong.
Exactly. They're both seeing things accurately, but only from their own point of view. They haven't quite grasped that there isn't one single correct view. It all depends on where you're standing, literally.
So they're kind of stuck in their own little worlds, unable to see the bigger picture, or that both of them could actually be right.
Exactly. And that's where Moshman introduces this concept called, get this, metasubjective objectivity.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
It is. But it's a really cool idea. He's saying true rationality isn't about ignoring our own subjective experiences, but about understanding how those experiences fit together to create a more objective view of reality.
So it's not about my way or the highway, but about recognizing that everyone has a limited perspective. And the smartest approach is to try to combine those perspectives to get a more complete understanding.
You nailed it. It's like how scientists use multiple data points and different research methods to build a more accurate model of how the world works. No single perspective captures the whole picture.
And this whole idea of coordinating perspectives, it's not just for understanding where a bench is in a room, right? It's important for like all aspects of development, rational thinking, moral reasoning, even identity formation.
It's all connected, for sure. And you know what? Moshman actually makes this brilliant connection between this idea and Piaget's theory of how kids develop their sense of morality through playing with other kids. Remember the example with the kids trying to figure out how to split the candy fairly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They start out just trying to get as much candy for themselves as possible, but then
Through arguing, negotiating, and seeing things from each other's point of view.
they end up with a more sophisticated understanding of fairness. It becomes something that's good for everyone, not just about what each individual wants.
Exactly. It's not some grown-up coming in and laying down the law. It's the kids themselves, figuring out their own moral code through social interaction and perspective taking.
So cool. And that ties back to what Moshman was saying about self-regulation, right? Like, it's a key part of development.
Right. Teenagers aren't just passively soaking up information or being molded by the adults in their lives. They're active participants in the process. They're building their understanding of the world, their sense of right and wrong, and their own identities.
It's like they're little philosophers, scientists, and artists all at the same time, constantly experimenting, testing boundaries, and figuring out what it all means.
I love that. Think about all the ways teens express their identities. The clothes they wear, the music they listen to, the groups they hang out with, even the online personas they create.
It's like they're trying on different hats, you know, seeing what fits, what feels right, what feels authentic to who they are.
Absolutely. And yeah, sometimes it can feel like they're changing hats every 5 minutes, which can be a little frustrating for the adults around them.
For sure. But you're saying all that experimentation from a developmental perspective, it's actually a good thing.
It is. It means they're actively engaged in figuring out who they are and where they fit in the world.
It does make you wonder, though, is there ever a point where too much experimentation can be a problem? Like, could they get lost in all the possibilities?
That's a great question, and Moshman acknowledges that this process doesn't always go smoothly. There can be bumps in the road, setbacks, even full-blown crises sometimes. He actually points out how sometimes our sense of identity can get in the way of being rational.
You mean like when we cling so tightly to our beliefs and who we think we are, that we reject anything that challenges those beliefs, even if it's true?
Exactly. It's like we build these mental walls around ourselves to protect our sense of self, but those walls can also trap us and keep us from growing.
And teenagers, with their identity still forming and changing, they must be extra vulnerable to that kind of thinking.
For sure. They're still figuring out what they believe, what they stand for, so any challenge to those beliefs can feel like a personal attack, like their whole world is being shaken up.
That makes a lot of sense. So how can adults help teenagers navigate all of this? Is it about telling them what to think, or is there a different approach?
Moshman's view is that our role isn't to tell them what to think, but to create spaces where they feel safe to explore different ideas, challenge their own assumptions, and even change their minds without feeling like they're losing themselves in the process.
So, like, creating a learning environment that's both supportive and challenging, kind of like what we're doing here with this deep dive, I hope.
I think so. We're providing a framework, but also encouraging you to think critically, connect it to your own experiences, and come to your own conclusions.
And that's what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. It's not just about understanding teenagers out there. It's about understanding ourselves, our own past, our own development, and how we continue to build our identities and our sense of morality throughout our lives.
That's a great way to put it. Ready to shift gears a bit and explore how all of this connects to education. Moshman has some really thought-provoking ideas about the role of schools in supporting adolescent development.
Let's do it. I'm all ears. So, we've been on this incredible journey, right? Exploring how teenagers think, how they develop their sense of right and wrong, how they build their identities. Fascinating stuff. Now, let's talk about education. How does all this research by Moshman, all these insights, change the way we think about teaching and learning, especially for teenagers?
This is where Moshman's work gets really, down to earth,
Yeah.
practical. The last part of his book is all about what these ideas mean for education, specifically high school. And man, he makes some powerful points.
So he's not just talking about teaching facts and formulas and stuff.
No, not at all. He's saying the big overarching goal of education should be to help students become rational thinkers.
Which makes sense, right? Given everything we've learned about how teenagers are developing these complex reasoning skills, asking big questions about knowledge and morality and who they are in the world, it's a lot.
It is. And Moshman takes it even further. He says the most important thing schools can do to encourage that kind of rationality is to create an environment of intellectual freedom.
So, like, not just telling them what to think, but giving them the space and the tools to figure out how to think for themselves.
Exactly. He uses this really cool analogy about scientific research. Imagine, he says, a scientific community where you're not allowed to question certain ideas, where dissenting opinions get shut down, where information is tightly controlled.
Oh man, that sounds stifling. How could science ever move forward if researchers can't challenge old theories, test new ideas, or even make mistakes along the way?
Exactly. And Moshman says the same goes for education. If we want students to become truly rational thinkers, they need to be exposed to a variety of viewpoints. They need access to all sorts of information. And they need to feel safe sharing their own ideas, even if those ideas are unusual or go against the grain.
That makes me think about how sometimes as adults we can get so attached to our own beliefs that we close ourselves off to anything that challenges those beliefs, even if it's valid.
Yeah, it's a human thing to do, for
Yeah.
sure. But it's something we have to watch out for, especially when we're working with teenagers. They're at this stage where they're forming their own beliefs. And if they feel like they can't question or explore different perspectives, they might just tune out altogether.
And Moshman actually cites research showing that even little kids have a surprisingly good grasp of intellectual freedom, and that understanding just keeps developing as they become teenagers.
It's not that teenagers are just being rebellious for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Like they want to reject everything adults say. It's deeper than that. They have this strong sense of fairness and this need to think for themselves.
So when schools try to clamp down on that autonomy, it can totally backfire.
Oh, yeah. It can lead to resentment, rebellion, and kids just not really caring about learning.
It's like telling a musician they can only play the notes that are written on the sheet music, right? They might become technically skilled, but they'll never develop their own unique voice or create anything truly original.
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting? Moshman connects this idea of intellectual freedom back to moral development. Remember we talked about the justice perspective, where fairness and individual rights are super important.
Right. So how does that tie in?
He's saying that intellectual freedom is a moral issue, basically. It's about respecting students' right to think for themselves, to form their own beliefs, and to be part of a free exchange of ideas without being censored or punished for thinking differently.
So it's about seeing them as individuals with their own thoughts and perspectives, not just empty containers waiting to be filled with information.
Exactly. And this isn't just important for how individuals develop. It's important for society as a whole. We want to live in a world where people can think critically, have reasonable discussions, and make informed decisions. We have to nurture those skills in kids from a young age.
So it's way bigger than just getting them ready for college or a job, right? It's about giving them the tools to be active, engaged, thoughtful members of their communities and the world.
Absolutely. And that means letting them make mistakes, question authority, and disagree with each other respectfully. It's about creating a space where curiosity is celebrated, different perspectives are welcomed, and the process of figuring things out is just as important as getting the right answer.
Wow. This deep dive has been such an eye-opener. I'm walking away with a whole new understanding of how teenagers think and learn.
Me too. And while we've been focusing on schools, this idea of fostering rationality and intellectual freedom,
Yeah.
it's not just on them.
It's something we can all do, right? In how we interact with teenagers, whether we're parents, teachers, mentors, or just people sharing this world with them.
Exactly. We can listen to them, engage them in real conversations, show them that we respect different viewpoints, even when we disagree.
And maybe most importantly, we can trust them to figure things out, to
Hmm.
navigate the ups and downs of growing up, knowing they have the potential for both incredible insight and amazing growth.
I love that.
And
And
we know.
who knows? By supporting intellectual freedom in the young people around us, we might even learn a thing or two ourselves along the way.
That's a great thought. So, to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds working. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of adolescent development.